Today's subject is so solemn that we thought it would be best listened to without commercial interruption. As gamekeepers, wildlife and our heritage of hunting is always a priority. Help us get the word out by sharing this episode with like-minded friends. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jeff Foxworthy, and welcome to Gamekeeper Podcast. If you want to learn more about farming for wildlife and habitat management, then, buddy, you are in the right place. Join the Gamekeeper crew direct from Mossy Oak Land Enhancement Studio as they discuss the latest wildlife and habitat management practices, news, and of course, hunting. There's no telling what you'll learn, but I'm going to tell you, I bet it's interesting. Enjoy.
We're live in 3, 2, 1.
Morning, everybody. Here we are, West Point, Mississippi. It's a hot day.
It is.
But we're going to talk ducks.
Speaking of ducks, we had a flyover yesterday, didn't we, Dudley?
We did.
And I'll have to say that was one of the coolest things I've ever experienced.
Yeah.
So a podcast listener, avid outdoorsman, Lot Lewis. I think he's from Livingston, where the Hollies are from.
Huh.
And he just messaged me the other day and said, "Hey, I'm coming to West Point in my what kind of helicopter?
A big black helicopter.
A big Black Hawk."
Yeah.
And anyway, he just said, "Oh, we just left Camp Shelby. We'll probably be there at about 5:15." And so we all went outside and waited on him, and
Sure enough, he showed up.
Yeah.
and
cool.
it was so cool. We were all just chill bumping and vibing and jumping up and down, and
They circled around.
yeah.
us a
circled
little bit.
around, and then they did this thing where they tilted it to the left and then tilted it to the right, and we were just hooting and hollering.
Yeah.
Bobby was definitely vibing over there.
I enjoyed
I'm
it.
gonna tell you.
I'm very patriotic, and it was really cool.
Hey, we
So,
appreciate everybody's service.
And that's my friend. I think his Insta handle is Lot America. So check him out. Thank you so
Are we gonna
much,
post
Lot.
anything on social about it?
I don't. I saw where Dudley posted something. On
All
social.
right.
So-
well, good.
Yeah. So that was fun. And
Yeah.
thanks.
So thanks, Lot, and all your buddies that were in that thing. I
There's gotta
wish
be more
I
than one
joined the
person.
military, and I didn't, and I've always
The
regretted it.
military
so-
would have done you some
Come
good.
on.
Yeah.
Come on, Dudley. Don't regret it. We can make it like the military more if you
That's
like.
right.
So today, guys, well, I've been anticipating this one for a long time, wanting to talk.
This is
And
really interesting.
We've got
Oof.
two duck doctors.
It's really important, actually.
We've
really
got two
important.
waterfowl wise men, if you will.
Wise guys.
Wise men, I'm going to
Okay.
say. But let me just start on the couch first because he's sitting there grinning. And he's been here before.
Yeah.
We've got Dr. Brian Davis. He is a favorite at Mississippi State. The kids love him. And they say he's great on field trips. And then we've got, through the magic of the Zoom, we've got Dr. Phil Lavretsky. Phil, and I hope I pronounced that right.
Straight
You
ahead.
got it.
Perfect.
Right on the point.
And look, he is with the University of Texas at El Paso.
And he
There you
said
go.
they call him Dr. Phil, right?
That's what he said. Yeah, Dr. Phil. So he's he's down there in that hot West Texas on the Mexico
Wind,
border,
arid kind of stuff.
and he
yeah.
talks like they have some ducks down there.
Of course they do.
Just a few.
He's got some on his wall. I know that. So there's got to be some down there.
Do you really have ducks down there?
We got them. We got them year round. We got actually a growing population of Canada geese, as the rest of the country.
Yeah.
I see them all the time now. We've got Mexican ducks year round. Wood ducks are increasing year round. But then we've got, once winter comes, in fall, pretty much every other species comes through us. Divers and dabblers and more or less everything besides sea ducks. Although I will say I shot one surf scoter a few years back. That was real weird. But
Wow.
yeah, we get to see pretty much the gamut. Every year is different depending on the migration, what's going on. But the nice thing is that not a lot of pressure if you know where you're going, and lots of public land, and it's actually pretty great because I hunted California. I grew up in California. I hunted the Sac Valley there. I went to Ohio, turned more into a deer hunter because all you had were mallards and Canada geese every so often, and it was all field hunting. And then I came back here, and it was a lot more open water, big spreads, calling, but I didn't have the whole situation of guys shooting 200-300 yards away, spooking all the ducks like I did in California, and I could let them work, and it's quite beautiful. So I'm pretty happy where I am.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's awesome.
Great to
Yeah.
hear.
Yeah. Are those birds working those cattle ponds across Texas, coming down, utilizing those?
That's a great question. They're using the Rio to come down, right? But then they're hitting all the ag lands that are out here, especially in New Mexico. They've got cotton, corn, and the big thing is that with all the pecan farmers out here, they flood all that pecans. So that just draws them. I mean, within a 24-hour period of a farmer flooding his field, if you go out there, you'll just see thousands of birds. They know when those fields get flooded, and it's pretty impressive. But yeah, they're just kind of filtering through, and then we hold them on the river and some of the big stock tanks out here. But actually, we've got a project in Arizona right now with Ducks Unlimited and others with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the state agencies to actually ask that question: how are Mexican ducks and other resident ducks actually utilizing this desert, arid landscape? And we're already learning there's stock tanks out there that we didn't even know about, and they're using them. They're showing us the way, so to speak. And a lot of times they'll go up mountains to be on the high elevation plateaus where there's water up there, and they'll come down. They'll do these like elevational change, a migration, so to speak, changes across the season. So we're starting to learn more and more about it around here.
Made me think of all those places you said they were using reservoirs you didn't even know we had. I bet they. Yeah, I mean, you tell me, but I bet they're using places they aren't bothered, or people didn't even think to try to hunt them. Over time. It kind of pushes pressure or push them into spots.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. The fun fact about all this. So we've got another project, a similar project in the brush country of West Texas. We just published on it, and I don't know if you're familiar, but there's a declining numbers of mottled ducks on the Gulf Coast region there, especially in Texas. And what we're finding is that almost the exact number of birds declining are being recovered in this interior area. And so we did a whole bunch of genetics. We're putting a bunch of telemetry data out there. And what we're finding is these birds, not only mottled ducks, but also Mexican ducks, are honing in on all these ranches that have these beautiful stock tanks for all their big game that nobody hunts, right? And corn feeders right by the tank and all the predators being managed. It's like apparently a mecca where they're coming in and they're sitting on them and they're living their life out there, because nobody's going to shoot that mottled duck when you've got, 280 point, whitetail walking around for a lot more money.
I would.
Wow.
I mean, I would too. That's what I was doing down there, and that's when I was driving around and we were scientifically collecting these birds in May and stuff like that. And I finally came to the realization why those birds are there. It's just these when that corn feeder goes off, it's just flood of mottled ducks and Mexican ducks that just pour out of the sky. When I was out there. And so the realization is that they're honing in on these new habitats, like you guys were saying, is that, we know about those stock tanks, but we didn't know how they were utilizing them, and they definitely are. And so the same is true out in the deserts, where they've got cattle farmers and they've got stock tanks and different amounts of water on the landscape, and now just trying to figure out how exactly they're doing it.
So before we go down the road of the DNA discussion, I'm looking at Dr. Davis, and you guys are both, y'all dedicated your lives to studying waterfowl, and you're in two vastly different parts of the country. I mean, you've got access to the Mississippi Delta, some historically great duck hunting, and the research that you do has got to be a lot different than what Dr. Phil's doing over there. But do y'all compare notes and talk to each other regularly about things?
Yeah, everybody kind of has their own game plan, I guess. But we're collaborating now on the mallard genetics work, and so we use people's interest and research programs, I guess, to kind of mesh and integrate and answer specific questions. And early on, Phil's the genetics guru, and there'd be times he'd call me. He's like, "All right, this is what's going on, but what's going on? Why are the ducks this, that, and the other?" So it's fun to work with people that bring a different perspective. And look, in today's world, it's so complicated, politically, financially, Ecologically, you just really have to work in teams anymore to really. We've worked in silos for so long. That's not a bad thing, but as time goes on, as much as we do know about waterfowl, we really need to work kind of at larger scales to answer some more questions that probably haven't been able to do before. So, yeah, having experts like Phil and a lot of other people are great. We were laughing earlier about duck country. I grew up in Missouri. I'm driving to Starkville, Mississippi down I-55, and I'm thinking, where am I going? I mean, this is like pine trees and hills. There ain't a dang duck. I'm like, what am I gotten myself into? And then I realized, what was going on. Then I realized the Delta was on the other side of the hill. But that was a rude awakening at first. So,
and last thing, and then we'll get started. But we're dealing with 3 different countries here. You got Canada, obviously, America, and then obviously some of these birds are making it down to Mexico. Do these other countries cooperate like you guys would want them to?
Yeah, like we say, ducks know no boundaries, right? So, North American Waterfowl Management Plan, the treaty, North America and Mexico, and so they're all linked. Mexico, DUMAC, I don't know where they are. I'm not the best person to talk details about that, but they've done some really amazing things, and they're still really active. And of course, you've got to negotiate politics and all those kind of things in other countries. But it's ducks know no boundaries.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is, you're right. So all these flyways have specific needs that are very distinguishable. But my genetics is universal, right? So I can work with just about any organism you can throw at me that's got DNA, right? And some funding. So my questions can stem across space and time, as hopefully we'll be able to talk about here. And you're right. So I have partners. So we published a paper in 23 that spans basically the world. We have samples. As you can see on my wall, if the viewers can see, that was from New Zealand. We just finished Australia. We have birds out of Africa. We have birds out of throughout Europe and Eurasia. Canada, Mexico, I basically have worked with every Canadian Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, state agency, Mexico agencies, including DUMAC, to get these samples, right? My freezers have probably 20,000 samples of a variety of species, obviously mallards being a primary source or primary target these days. And so it's been awesome. Being able to secure samples at that kind of scale and across time, especially with hunters and museums and all this other stuff that hopefully we'll touch on, that has really been able to allow us to ask new questions that if we all worked independently, we would otherwise not be able to do. I need Brian as much as I would say he needs me.
Yeah. So on a lot of these publications that get posted,
the 2 of them right here.
I mean, there's usually going to be 5 or 6 names on each one, and they're going to be from different universities. There may be a couple grad students on there, learning as they're doing, and they may do a lot of the field work, and so it's a great process.
Yeah.
So, Phillip, why don't you start and just kind of tell us about this duck DNA project and where it's been, where it's going, what you're excited about. Let's just open the door.
Yeah, what you're finding.
Yeah. All right. So, where do we start?
Where does he start?
The big thing here is the focus of year 1. So Duck DNA. This is a project with Ducks Unlimited, right? So this is the first citizen science-based project at the scale that we've attempted that's never been done with any other organism. Any other wildlife system has this sort of thing that's baked in. More or less, my lab is basically 23andMe or Ancestry.com for wildlife, right? You send me a sample, I tell you what it is. And so what we started to think about when I started to find patterns in the mallard, the genetics of the mallards of North America that has been quite concerning is how do we get a larger reach, get hunters involved, and get basically data sets that would be unimaginable if I just tried to do it by myself. And so Duck DNA was born between a collaboration between myself and Ducks Unlimited. Last year was the first effort. We were able to secure funding for about 300 kits. We had 4,200 applicants, all 49 states except for Hawaii, where there's no duck hunting. We sent out all those kits. We got about, out of the 1,500 samples that we sent out, we got about 1,000 back, which is great. And we had thankfully, a rate better than 99% of all samples returned worked. We got great ancestry, and now we're studying what's happening to mallard populations at the national level this way. Year 2 is upon us. We just actually got off the phone. I got off the phone or the Zoom or Teams or whatever it was with Ducks Unlimited. And so we're about to start year 2. So I hope everybody can get on the website, www.duckdna.com. Get your name in there. I think we're going to have almost 700 kits that we're going to be giving away. Free to hunters. All you do, you get drawn, kind of like your elk hunt, except better odds. You get drawn, and you get a kit. There'll be something like about 3 vials. You snip off the tip of the tongue of whatever duck you want me to analyze. You put that in and you send it back to us, right? And then we've got this nice app that's being developed where you can keep track of all the harvest that you've had, and then you're going to get these certificates, ancestry certificates, like congratulations, you shot, a whatever. And it's been phenomenal. It's not only been phenomenal in the way to grow my own data set and for research purposes, but honestly, we've had so much outpouring of like folks just saying, my kid wasn't going to go duck hunting until he or she was like, oh, I want to do it, but I want my duck, ancestry. So this is a new, appears to be a really great engagement tool to the youth and to other hunters, and we hope to keep it going. And so obviously that's been a key aspect currently, but all of that project stemmed from what we were finding in North American mallards. Now, this is the part where I ask you, how deep do you want me to go into this?
As deep as you think we
can comprehend.
Yeah, because we need the broader world out there. What do they need to know? And we need the truth. The last thing we need to do is keep the truth away from people about stuff.
So a bit of background, and I have to preface all of this with the fact that my team only started learning about this about 2019, 2020, really trying to, and then right after that, we just through all of these collaborations, including with Brian and Michigan folks at Michigan State, Tennessee Tech, Doug Osborne, at Monticello in Arkansas, and LSU folks, and Mississippi State, other Mississippi State folks, and Clemson, and everybody else, and SUNY ESF, Mike Schumer out there. None of what I'm about to describe would be possible without those collaborations. So again, it only works when we all work together, kind of thing. And we're trying to catch up to basically what the Europeans are now seeing in mass. We're trying to catch up to that to try to maybe move the needle backwards than towards where they're already headed or at, basically. So with that, mallards, right? King of all ducks, for hunters especially, weren't really a mainstay in northeastern U.S. until about the 1950s, more or less. Now, what happened was a twofold thing. In the 1920s, people wanted greenheads out there. And the history shows that the state, feds, and private individuals attempted to breed wild birds, but it didn't take. Right? Wild birds don't just make eggs like a chicken, right? So somebody must have known that Europeans had been actually doing this for some time, because they brought in a bird which is known as a game farm mallard. And I will say that the word game farm mallard is equal to being I have a lab and it was once a wolf. So if nobody knows this, all domestic ducks are of mallard origin, right? The mallard, the European mallard, the wild European mallard was the wolf of all domestic lineages. Pekin duck and call ducks and rowans and whatever you want to call, all have their origin to a mallard. All right, so they started production in 1920 and started to bring them here and started releasing them. But figures show about 500,000 a year till about 1960. That number is thought to have decreased to about 250,000, mostly on the Atlantic flyway. But our current census or attempts to get census of how many releases, we think it's much, much more than that. Anyways, on top of that, you have folks, cutting down the boreal forest in Ontario and elsewhere. And so you sort of creating a prairie pothole kind of look and sort of this movement of prairie pothole mallards, eastward was occurring. So this kind of situation was occurring in the Mississippi and the Great Lakes region, as well as the northeastern part and much of the Atlantic flyway. So the idea was that the release of these birds had no implication on wild population. This is the same thing that I was taught when I was at UC Davis. I'm sure everybody, and I still hear it today from everybody. And so it wasn't something I was looking at. The idea was that you release these things, they die. If they don't die, they don't leave. If they leave, they don't survive. They survive, they don't have babies, right? This was the logic that was behind it. So come 2019, I have a project with looking at genetics of American black ducks and mallards. And I started getting these signatures, especially in the Atlantic flyway, of this like alternative non-Western mallard, non-prairie pothole mallard in the genetics. And I was like, what the heck is this? I knew about the history, and I was like, I'm pretty sure this is it, but only one way to figure this out. So we went out. Well, some folks went out. My wife primarily went out and shot some game farm mallards because we needed a source. And so we did the genetic ancestry of that. In 2020, we published and we showcased, yes, that alternative non-wild mallard signature, non-North American wild mallard signature was indeed these game farm mallards. So again, if the dogma was true that these things do not survive, do not breed, they shouldn't have any babies, and there shouldn't be any of their genetics out in the wild, but they are there, right? So all the samples I had were hunter harvested birds from the wing bee, right? So these are birds being harvested on WMAs and whatever from wild flocks, and the genetics of these game farm mallards was everywhere. It was primarily prevalent at that time in the Atlantic flyway. About only 8% of harvested mallards on average, some states better than others, were considered wild.
Wow.
Now, that was sampling in 2010. The paper that we published last year in 2023, which was this worldwide mallard sampling effort, by 2020, I could only find 2% of mallards harvested in the Atlantic flyway, again, an average, being of wild origin. So it went from 8 to 2. So just getting worse.
So 98% have this domestic duck.
Have a substantial amount of game farm ancestry in their lineage.
Wow.
This compared to the Atlantic flyway, the Mississippi flyway, which was at the time about 40%, so 60% of them were wild. And then it really declined once you hit the prairie potholes and the Central and Pacific flyways, where it was actually almost the reverse. It was less than 10% of samples having substantial game farm mallard ancestry. She had this decline east to west kind of thing. All right, so we figured out that these things are basically changing the genetic integrity of our wild populations, especially in the Atlantic flyway and especially in the Mississippi. Now, the Mississippi is an interesting facet because it's actually a two-set dynamic. This is where partnership with Brian and Doug and Osborne and others, where we were like, hey, let me get some birds out of the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, basically like the lower Mississippi Alluvial Valley, so your area, where you are right now, and elsewhere. And then I partnered with Ben Lukanen out of Michigan State to get a whole bunch of samples out of the Great Lakes. And what we found is wildly different signatures. You guys shoot basically wild mallards. There's less than 8% of them that have substantial amount of game farm in them. The Great Lakes, however, is now pushing 60 to 70%. Some states like Indiana being over 80% of them just simply game farm mallards now. So the interesting aspect here, of course, is it's wildly weird that the two places, the northeastern part of the Atlantic Flyway and the Mississippi and the Great Lakes of the Mississippi Flyway, are the two places where there's increasing trends in game farm ancestry and wild populations, and those are the two populations that are continuously declining. So, of course, everybody always says, like, well, it's just genetics, how do you know it's a problem? And you're right. Like, we would need really good information to say that it is a problem. So this, again, stemmed to, so we've got a bunch of what I just said is published. What I'm about to say is about to be published. The projects, all those birds that we sort of sampled in the Mississippi Flyway, again, Ben Lukanen's work up in the Great Lakes, so all the states surrounding the Great Lakes, and then Doug Osborne, Brian Davis, as well as others that were tagging birds in Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi. We were able to look at, okay, what is the genetic ancestry and what do they do? What's their migratory pattern? What is their survival? How many, if it's a hen, does it breed? If it does it, well, how many eggs does it have? All these kinds of things. And your birds have just a beeline to the Dakotas. Like, there's just this straight path. It's just constant. And not surprising, but like, you hit the Dakotas, I can't find a game farm mallard in there, right? Which is great. And so you have this connection. But when you go to the birds out of the Great Lakes, their migration, quote unquote, is effectively a random walk today. If they leave, they are incapable of making long distance movements. They have longer stopovers. If they do stop, they stay there longer. And I'll talk about potentially why. And a lot of times there's this like wall in Tennessee, and for 3 years in a row, birds that even left the Great Lakes will hit this wall and just either go slightly north of it or go straight back to the Great Lakes. So this is also indicator of potentially what you used to get, this secondary population influx out of the Great Lakes, probably your November or Halloween mallards, whatever you want to call them, are probably were those birds, but they effectively they are no longer innate in their capacity to migrate. And then you can ask me, is this part of the genetics? We associated genetics with migratory behavior, and it's blew my mind how well correlated they are. The more game farm ancestry they have, the longer the stopovers, the shorter the distance, the more random walk it is, and so forth and so on. What about the hens that actually bred? The ones that survived and made it into that next season, the ones that had more than 70% game farm typically stuck to urban settings. When they would typically, they actually more or less only incubated for about 2 weeks. And then they would leave. And of course, Ben would send out a tech out there and be like, oh, like, she sort of made a nest, but there are eggs basically pooped around everywhere. And so that's not great. In general, what we found is for every bird that's got more than 70% game farm, so less than 30% wild, those birds, you needed 3 of those birds for every 1 wild bird equivalent in nesting capacity. So to get the same number. So it's a 3-to-1 ratio. All right. So we've got all this information, right? So highly inability. Genetics was statistically associated with migratory behavior, breeding behavior. They were 2 times likelier to pick urban versus rural settings. So that we've got all that kind of information. And then what I'll tell you is Mike Schumer and Brian and I had this NSF, and part of this NSF was to bring birds into captivity, which was in Forbes Biological Station, and Panola Aviaries helped us out. So we had these 2 locations. And man, when we had game farm or wild birds, you could walk into a pen and you know what that bird is. A wild bird would make a nest, but no eggs because it's stressed out. You walk into a bird that's a game farm female, there's like a half-ass attempt at a nest and basically eggs everywhere. And you will get eggs as long as you feed them Purina Chow. So high protein diet, you just keep getting eggs. What else we learned is that they're about 50% inefficient in their if you force them to eat wild seeds, right? So Masio goes, buys a property, turn it into a beautiful wetland. And if you've got a bunch of these types of birds on the landscape, you've actually decreased their ability to survive. So the carrying capacity of that habitat would be higher if it was a golf course than if it was a beautiful wetland for those types of birds. More or less, what we found is a 50% reduction in feeding efficiency in a game farm mallard is a wild mallard in wild seeds, 70% reduction in female game farm mallards, so they're like the worst. And so what we also, on top of all of that, anecdotally found is that when you feed Purina Chow to a wild mallard, it just goes back to 1,200 grams, right? It just gets fat. When you feed a Purina Chow to a game farm mallard, no matter how much you feed, it's always just like 700 to 900 grams. So what this bird is a bird that requires a ton of feed to maintain that won't put on fat. So you've got a bird with no fuel on the landscape that can't feed on wild seed. On top of it, what we found is that there's a statistical difference in their wing lengths. They're shorter wings, right? So you basically have a light. You took a jumbo jet and you put shorter wings, and you made them lighter, so they're flightier, but they are not able to sustain that kind of flight. So you think of true nature, which is freak storms, predator evasion, need to migrate long distances, maintain body composition to be able to even do that. You've got a bird that essentially has been transformed into more of a chicken than it is a duck. And that all together, that was like my fastest way of explaining a ton of research. So hopefully that gets through.
I mean,
But all of that really strongly suggests that not only have we changed the genetic integrity of many of our wild mallard populations, but that genetic integrity has a direct correlation in their ability to survive and breed on the landscape.
holy. Oh my goodness.
He's right. The other thing too, that basically what happens to the bills is they get shorter and taller. So think about a snow goose or a white-fronted goose where they're either grazing or pulling. So when you have a bird in captivity and all it has to do is eat seed, the nail on the end of the bill was longer in the game farm birds. Phil can correct me if I speak out of turn, but that nail's a little bit longer. The bills are taller and wider, but shorter. And so that is a recent adaptation to just needing to pick up a piece of food in captivity. You're not trying to strain chironomids and all kind of invertebrate larvae and beetles and spiders that these birds are eating out in the natural wetlands. So very inefficient in terms of adaptations, like Phil was saying, in wetland environments. So, and the legs are longer. They just run around these pens, right? So, just really maladaptive. And the age-old argument about, and before Phil came along, and I always tell him he's on the verge of telling us that everything we wrote in the scientific literature for the last 50 years is bunk, right? But you would always go back, the fallback was, we don't want domestic birds because of the disease, right? They spread disease. And now it's just so much, and whether that was really true or not, probably depends on the situation. But with all his work, all this collaborative work we're all doing, it just goes so the depths of this. You know, the morphological, the legs and the bill and the head, and it's amazing. It's startling.
You know,
Yeah.
I'd like to think that duck hunters probably philosophize more about, you know, why aren't they doing this? Why are they doing this more than any other hunters out there, even turkey hunters.
Yep.
And I mean, this was never brought up in discussions, you know, amongst my friends or whatever in the past. So when did somebody like philosophize this? Or, I mean, I remember when I lived in the Mississippi Delta, there was a game farm, and people would kind of talk bad about it, like how silly it is. You know, you sit there and 200 ducks just fly in because they're trained to, you know, they put this feed out and they shoot these ducks. And but so this is what we're talking about is game farm ducks, hunters making these areas where they have these tame ducks that fly for you to shoot. What has caused this.
And when I was a DU employee, I got invited on a hunt. It was all legal in a state near us. I won't mention it. And I got to the blind, and these things are swimming around up around the decoys. I'm like, good God, do I even want to do this? You know?
Right. And we've done this with quail. It happens with deer. You know, I'm scared to talk about these controversial subjects on this podcast, but
Well, I mean,
it needs to be talked about.
This is genetic facts.
So we've been
You know,
trying
this
to
is what's
play
happening.
God, and this is the result.
Yeah. Let me just interject three things. Okay, so the first thing that Brian mentioned, so that's called artificial selection, right? Even no matter what happens, once you take wild things into a captive setting, you inadvertently are changing everything about them, right? The way you pick, right? The ones you want to breed, the ones you don't want to breed, how you do all of that changes the genetics and all the traits that are associated, right? You don't want a hen that only lays 2 eggs. You want a hen that lays 100 eggs, right? You want to go towards that if you were a breeder, right? That's production. And so what seems to have happened is that the way I see it is Brian's right. So what we see are these longer legs. The only time in evolutionary terms that I see long legs are birds that make it to islands where they're adapting to be less flighted, right? They're more running. They become they're losing flight basically. And so the bill is this shorter, fatter thing, essentially more or less turning into something that can peck because their line of sight can identify it better than a longer bill is what we hypothesize. But on top of that, when you take that bill and you shorten it and you have those lamella, right? So the things that allows a duck to filter, you're actually compressing all of those lamella closer together. And we also have data that suggests they've lost lamella. So the spacing is no longer the same as a wild bird. So even if it tries to feed using compaction the way it should, by filter feeding, it no longer is filtering the way a wild bird does because its bill has completely been transformed. And we've done that. And you're right. And so you're talking about, so everybody would always be like, how do we know this is going to be bad? And I promise, well, you could go to Europe and see how that's going, right? So they've been doing this for about 100 years longer than we have. France alone puts out 2 to 3 million a year to have a fall flight, right? All these countries are more or less losing that capacity to have a wild bird on the landscape to actually survive. What does that typically lead to is a trout pond, right? Trout aren't going to be there unless we put them in there. But the problem is that if you keep doing this over and over time, like we know in fisheries and other fisheries like salmon, bobwhite, deer, pheasants, the longer you persist in a cage, the worse they become in the wild. And that is why if we ever want to change that kind of dynamic, we need to have a system in which flocks are or herds are genetically vetted to ensure that their inbreeding is down, that their population genetics is closer and closer to what the wild one is. So if they do get out and they do breed with the wild birds or deer, fish, the problems that results in will be lessened. And I will just say this. Somebody did say to me, I won't name them, they're like, well, the interbreeding between two birds should result in increased genetic diversity. That is true if both mom and dad have lots of genetic diversity. The problem is that domestic animals usually have less genetic diversity and more inbreeding. So what I had one of my students that just graduated do is we looked at a bunch of genetic diversity indices, including inbreeding, and we associated with how much game farm mallard they had, and it was a perfect correlation. So individuals with more game farm are more inbred. So by putting those individuals on the landscape, you're essentially creating clutches that are almost twice as inbred. Each individual is twice as inbred had it been two wild parentals. And I think a lot of that is also going to stem or explain at least some of the dynamics we're seeing in the landscape with population declines and whatnot. Because typically, like we learned in the Florida panther, right, it takes a bit of time for all the issues sort of to arise. But once you start seeing the issues, well, you're kind of too late, and you're going to need to have an influx or try to have an influx, like we had to move Texas panthers into Florida just to get that genetic diversity back on track. And my fear is that at least the northern part of the Atlantic flyway is headed towards that more and more. And I would just add, in addition to thousands of samples, all summer birds from the Atlantic flyway, from banding crews that are banding all these birds. And there are specific states like Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, that I can't find a wild bird that they're banding.
Oh my goodness.
Man.
Look, take
I'm
it.
speechless.
Yeah,
I can't. I'm so sick. I can't.
Take a deep breath there, Doc, and let me look. You know so much about this, and when you look into a crystal ball, what are you thinking is going to happen?
Well, so if we just stay on on course, we're all just gonna like ignore it. More likely than not, population declines will continue. How that population declines will probably vary with the amount of birds we put on the landscape. And the reason I say this is what we're seeing in our data set. So we have another grad student, we went to 26 national museums and we got genetic information from birds from 1800 to today across every flyway, and we tracked what happened through time. And what we're finding is that Mother Nature more or less needs 3 generations, which is about 3 years in mallards, to essentially get rid of is this a kid-friendly, the crap, this bad stuff, the maladaptive stuff. The problem is how much do we put versus how fast can natural selection kind of get rid of it. These two things are against each other. The problem with the Northeast, like I mentioned, the second you don't have a parental pool, then all you have are hybrids with hybrids. And the probability of recessive alleles, right? So if you know anything, like the probability of 2 inbred individuals making an individual that will have cancer quicker is higher and higher and higher. And so what you'll have is this sort of like inevitable spiral into kind of populations that are just worse and worse at their job. It's a theory. Or is that's more or less the theory, and we're seeing it, and France sees it, and we could go to those other countries and ask the question of like, how's your population doing? And they'll say not great unless we put birds out. You can ask the fisheries people, and you know how Bob White do if you just pen raise a bunch of birds and release them, right? That innateness to survive and breed in the wild is not usually there, and it usually takes about 3 generations of successive breeding for that to start to accumulate in the cage. That's why I think that an influx of wild into pools is an important aspect. Now, what can we do? I think there's still lots of things that we can do. We have a project in Hawaii that's just starting where we're actually going to see if we can artificially move the genetic needle through specific management strategies, those being supplementation and removal of a specific group towards a specific group. There, we can control basically every aspect. And if it works there, we can actually then potentially start to apply it into larger populations like in North America. Now, again, we published models that showcase in theory all of this is possible. This would require a ton of work and a ton of collaborations between U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Canadian Wildlife Services, and state agencies and private individuals and elsewhere. But it is theoretically possible to move the needle back.
Is it possible that some of these game farms that are releasing these birds, could we move toward in a direction where that is not, I mean, somehow we can prevent that from occurring?
Oh, that's a political question right there.
But I'm sorry.
I wonder how many of the people we've elected have hunted those places.
About power or influence or politics, because I mean, maybe in between, but when it comes to the best interest of the species, I'm sorry.
That's right.
You know what? It doesn't. What do you? I mean, we can't pour poison out everywhere. I mean, because it'll kill wildlife. I mean, you'll destroy things. I mean, obviously it has to be vetted by people like y'all and researched properly. But if this is truly happening, we don't have a choice. And if that is the cause of it, we do not have a choice. Now, maybe they can develop pure wild strain that those people can access to do this or something. I don't know. I'm not the researcher. I'm certainly not the guy. But I'm sorry if I'm on a soapbox, but we don't have a choice. Mm-hmm. And I don't care how much anybody has invested in this. If it is for sure the cause of the demise of our species, then our government and our people and our agencies, they do not have a choice. I'm sorry.
They don't. But the sad thing is this has been going on in Europe for longer, and they hadn't done anything about it over there.
Or maybe we're just like the ad for the SEC. Maybe it just means more over here or something. I think it does.
Well, I know it means more over here.
Well, so Europe, so there's a couple Scandinavian countries that are effectively are starting to ban it. They're just like, we're done with it. Norway banned it already. So Norway doesn't have it. Why am I blanking on it? What's the other Viking country?
Sweden?
Not
Sweden?
Sweden.
Scandinavia.
Denmark.
Belgium.
Denmark just put a moratorium, and all breeders are done by 2028. So they also said, forget this stuff. France probably will never do it. Maybe they will. I don't know.
They like four too much.
But so there is a growing concern in the same aspect. Now, we did talk about disease. We do need to talk about disease. I didn't know that this was happening, but there was a paper that just came out from some Smithsonian folks out of the Smithsonian who knew about this stuff because I had a postdoc there and I had I worked at the Smithsonian. So this is sort of like, they must have known about it. I had no idea they were going to do this, but they're a virology group. And so they went to a game farm mallard producer, bought 15, I think, birds, and just swabbed them. And lo and behold, these birds effectively had every disease known already in them, even though they haven't been in, quote unquote, the wild. And I actually thought about that. Not only is their genetic diversity low enough, so they're highly susceptible, but they're living in these pens with lots of individuals. The water is probably constantly low and warm because there's so many individuals. The diseases are in the landscape. You can't get rid of them. So they're constantly just now this reservoir. So are we inadvertently also, putting out H5N1 and other diseases unknowingly into the landscape by having these birds, not just releasing them, but like you said, there are groups that have these like sort of quote unquote natural flight patterns between locations. That doesn't stop a wild mallard from coming and interacting there, or a teal or a gadwall or anything else, right? And picking that stuff up. In my mind, the landscape of the breeders more or less mimics what we see in the spring migration when we start to see these die-offs, because lower amounts of water, lots of individuals, hotter environment because of all the bodies. So I think that part is playing a role. And now they've published on it that these things are effectively these potential reservoirs without knowing it, right? Because they're just out there. They're freely eating and walking around, so they're just going to pick it up anyways. So that is concerning. Does that explain why H5N1 is moving east to west instead of west to east like we thought it would? I don't know, but there's a growing evidence that suggests at least these birds, this breed is a particular issue in the disease ecology of waterfowl as well. And now that it translates past mallard, right? That translates to all wildlife, including apparently cows.
Wow.
Yep.
Lanny, you got something?
What you have just said, for one thing, is jaw dropping, but it explains so much of what we've been experiencing here in the Mississippi Flyway. Growing up, all of us, very, very avid waterfowlers, and it's just not been the same. And of all the things I've heard, this makes more sense with anything. You talking about the birds stopping in Tennessee. How many times have we talked about that?
Yeah, and it appears that, at least this is anecdotal, just listen to me, it appears the fact that people in the South don't even see ducks migrating down anymore.
We don't.
It's like, but you think about the further east it goes, the worse you hear about it.
Yeah.
And I can think, because I know of a lot of places in central and southern Alabama and over even where Bobby grew up, like Montgomery over to the east more, and they're like, we used to have so many ducks come down for the winter, even though we're not in a main flyway. It's just completely disappeared.
It has.
Yeah.
And that region, and Brian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that region, especially the Carolinas, I just came back from South Carolina doing a bunch of talks on this, but that was a predominant area of Great Lakes mallards moving. They would hit the northern part of the MAV and go east right into the Carolinas and Alabama and so forth. So that was a huge push that not only the MAV had, but also that the Carolinas had. Because honestly, that southeastern area of the Atlantic Flyway, not a ton of birds were coming from that northeastern area down. The majority of those mallards that were being shot in the 70s and 60s and so forth were these Great Lakes birds. And it seems we have this now timeline of change in the genetics of those kinds of birds. It seems pretty on par with the timing of declining populations and declining numbers of migratory mallards in certain regions. We're doing more analyses right now. Hopefully in the next year, we're going to have all this stuff published. But like I said, somebody asked, like, why hasn't this stuff been talked about? That's because we basically learned this in the last 4 years, right?
We're going to talk about it now.
It's been a very short amount of time. And Brian, I, and others are constantly on podcasts and elsewhere trying to get the word out, trying to tell people, because it's generations of people being told these birds are okay. It's really hard to change that mindset, because it's always going to be like, well, it can't be that bad, right? People will tell me, oh, no, it's just like a wild mallard. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a problem because it leaves. And then they'll be like, no, they never leave, right? I'm like, well, which one is it? So it's starting to get to the point where it's where we're all going to probably have to come to a table and sit down and have a conversation. And one of those conversations that came out in South Carolina was, if breeders are willing to effectively change flock to wild with a certification program that hopefully will go through me, where we tell them, okay, every 2 or 3 years, 10% of your flock has to be not only genetically vetted, but vetted for diseases. And if we find that it's transitioning or having high inbreeding coefficient, we have models to say you need 20 males for every 100 or 5 females or whatever we needed to do, that we would have to pull those individuals. Again, Fish and Wildlife Partners would have to amend permits for that, but pull those individuals to maintain the genetic ancestry of a flock. They would effectively be doing what we are going to probably eventually have to do, which is put a wild pool back into the Atlantic Flyway and into the Great Lakes region, so that way we can start to move the needle backwards. And I was going to tell you that I did run my model super, super coarsely because I've never imagined having to run a model for 500,000 population size. But in theory, we would need 62,000 mallards to be put out, wild mallards, every year for 5 years. And we could change the population back to over 90% wild.
That's not
which
too
is really
bad.
great,
That's
which
not
is
that
actually
bad.
better than
Bad.
I expected.
Yeah.
So, and if a breeder could take 1,000 mallards and turn it into 60,000, which I feel like they should be able to, then maybe there's a partnership there, right? How this goes down the road, that's all a conversation with everybody, because the breeders are also going to have to know that every female is not going to give you 100 eggs anymore, right? You're going to go to 30 eggs, maybe. So that,
Who cares?
how that conversation goes,
Yeah,
goes.
who
But,
cares?
Who
you know,
cares?
but in theory, it's possible, and it's not as bad as I thought it would be.
So
I guess.
yeah, let
We
me
got
just
to rally
ask.
the troops.
Yeah. Also, anecdotally, though, I was shocked to know I just didn't know in the last 5 or 6 years. I realized that tell us what's the length of the season and the limits in California and the Pacific Flyway.
Length of the season has been 110 days, and
So,
limits
yeah.
have been 7.
Yeah, so we're 60 days
Yeah,
at
we're
best.
60 at
They get
best.
110 days. I saw, won't call his name, really well-known guy that's a friend of mine, and he had 7 greenheads around his neck on a lanyard. And I was like, whoa. You can't, I realized, that's no proof you did anything wrong, and there's a guy taking the picture. They were his too. You won't get in trouble, but you just can't be seen with over limit. See, that's not over limit. So we can kill 7 greenheads out here. You have a 110-day season, and
I don't. I'm in the central. So
but I mean, they somewhere they did.
California.
And my
Yeah,
only
they
point was
did.
just saying, look at the success they're having in their reproduction
Yeah.
versus the success way
We're having.
east. Now, again, that's anecdotal, but I mean, y'all know
Makes
the
sense.
numbers. Those populations are not suffering as much, are they?
That's correct. So yeah, we just partnered with, or I just partnered with Cal Waterfowl Association, CWA, as well as Cal Fish and Game, to ask that question, like, what does the breeding stock look like in California? Because we know that California breeds a bunch of its mallards, right? Brian, if you remember, like 70 or 80% of mallard production is within state,
Yep.
I think.
Yep.
And so, like, how is that occurring? Like, is there genetic differences amongst them because they don't migrate? Maybe there's something different about them. How much game? But the problem is that we are picking up game farm. There's a game farm producer in California, and the proportion of individuals with game farm in them is starting to tick up, and it's ticking up in all the flyways, which is the problem, including the
Wow.
prairie potholes, which is a serious problem. Now, what the prairie potholes has that the Mississippi and the Atlantic don't anymore is a vibrant wild population. Apparently, that number is enough to be able to kind of, deal with that kind of inundation
Mitigate it.
every
Yep.
year, right? I'm really praying that folks in Nebraska and Dakotas aren't starting to think like we should just put out game farm mallards. And so, because I think that population will maintain, enough individuals, natural selection, and so forth. And so, I mean, those populations are doing well, and those are the same ones that don't have that. You have a fraction of individuals that carry game farm as compared to the other 2 flyways.
Well, the first thing that kind of comes to my mind is if there was a way that we could, like you just said in the Dakotas, where no new game farms. Let's draw no new game farms, but then somehow try to start limiting the use of the existing game farms and try to steer them in a direction to help them be sustainable in some other direction.
So it's ridiculous that these aren't regulated, because we also, we hear reports of game farms maybe of spreading disease, and very close to them, turkeys have just standing in somebody.
Seen it.
Lanny's seen it in his yard.
Yeah.
You
Have we been genetically
So I'm just
testing
saying,
turkeys?
yeah, not picking on anything. I'm just saying, could we be spreading disease by release quail, pheasant, chucker, ducks, anything, if they're not regulated, if they're not tested? And what you pointed out too is, of course we should, and we haven't been, I don't guess, but we've
Yeah,
forgotten
I mean,
about
I-
genetic. The genetic component is something everybody's ignored, it seems like.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they've it's genetics, and Brian can attest to this. Genetics in wildlife field has been a long slogging road. It is particularly because we were never that fast at it. It was expensive. But now my team basically turns out, 250 samples every 3 days, right? And we're doing it not just like at 10 markers. We're doing it at the scale as 23andMe. It's 20,000, 30,000 markers that we're looking at. So we're getting really fine scale ancestry across all these samples. And now through all my other studies, I basically have representative or reference samples for every species of North American waterfowl. We're hoping to fill in the goose gaps here soon. But yeah, so that's allowed us to get back to the point without those samples, we would never have been able to ask any of these questions. There's no way for 23andMe or Ancestry.com to tell you what you are if they don't have references, right? The only reason they're like, you're 10% Russian and 5% whatever, and they're constantly being like, would you like to reevaluate? Because they're constantly getting more and more data. And the more references that they have, like we are trying to get to, the more, the finer the detail as far as genetics is concerned. And you're right. We've largely ignored it because it was, how do you incorporate it into management decisions if it's 10 years down the line? But now my team effectively provides data within months. So now you can really actually make decision making to definitely within the year, between years of setting 100 bag limits or anything like that. We can definitely provide that kind of data, and that's what we've streamlined. I mean, we've got that Hawaii project. We're going to be doing ancestry of individuals within 2 weeks so we can know if we're releasing individuals or culling individuals or anything like that. And so we're getting it to pretty fine scale levels now. And I think now there's a level of interest, curiosity, and ability to start integrating this kind of data into management streams.
Brian, what are you thinking? What's going through your mind? You're deeply involved in this.
Yeah, no, it's he's just uncovered a whole new can of worms, obviously. But going back to Europe, it's kind of bittersweet. But Europe has been a wonderful laboratory for him because they've been doing it for so long. They release so many birds. I think it gives people like Phil kind of a head start as to what you were asking about, what's going to happen in the future. And I think that helps. And Europe is amazing. We have a lot of colleague friends over there that are wonderful, fantastic waterfowl biologists. And last year, I was thinking about this laughing. Last year at the DU State Convention, they asked me to give a talk on this work we're doing. And I started thinking, man, somebody's going to ask me, what are the limits in Europe? And I'm like, I'm embarrassed. I don't even know what the duck limits are in Europe. So then I started emailing my European buddies. I'm like, what's going on over there? I felt like just stupid. Like I don't even know. And basically it's like, Brian, there really are no limits. It's almost like a gentleman's, if I'm correct, Phil. I mean, there's basically, we have adaptive harvest management, which is just pages of mathematics and statistics about duck harvest. And yet over there, it's,
Well, they're not real ducks.
well, the other question for Phil, though,
not much public land.
the other question that I wanted to ask him, and he may know more about this now, but it's mallard, mallard, mallard. But how does this translate, Phil, like in Europe, for example, to other species? Are there any negative ramifications, or is it all contained within mallard, so to speak? Because that's another troubling aspect.
No one's. In my perspective, nobody's asked that question in Europe specifically, but we're asking that question with duck DNA. So kind of going full circle here, right? So we've got people harvesting all sorts of birds, including brewer's duck, which is a gadwall mallard, and pintail mallard, and teal mallard, and wood duck mallard, and all sorts of hybrids, right? That we're able to provide information. But on top of it, we're starting to ask, well, how many of these hybrids are actually due to wild versus game farm? And we're hoping, with a couple, 2-3 more years of data, we'll have a better understanding of how often does a game farm mallard interbreed with these other species as compared to a wild bird. I will tell you that there is a proportion especially from this year, between the brewer's ducks that we were able to ancestry that have game farm in them. So that's already, we're starting to understand that at a better level. How much of this is contained to mallard? Now, I will tell you, surprising to me, mottle ducks and Mexican ducks, while they interact with these things, their hybridization rates are less than 5%, right? And they're mostly contained in urban settings. So they're obviously just not picking. Now, where that breakdown happens to a mallard is because game farm mallards typically more or less look like a mallard, right? So they can't just be like, oh, you look funky and I don't breed. Top of it, game farm mallards have a really high propensity to breed and have extra pair copulation, all this other stuff. The black duck, however, is an interesting story. We continuously find hybrids, especially with duck DNA, and we're going to hopefully get this mapped out, but preliminary analyses suggest hybridization amongst black ducks in interior is much higher than if you got to coastal black ducks. All of it that basically are pure black ducks, right? Just so there's some sort of dynamic of probably birds that are attempting to breed in the interior that are just inundated with all these wild game farm hybridy things that just happens at a higher rate as compared to what I think is occurring is that you've got a bunch of really good black ducks in the boreal forest that still, mate correctly, fly to the salt flats to winter and then fly back, and they're choosing correctly as compared to some of these interior birds, whatever's left in the Great Lakes and breeding in the interior areas of the Northeast U.S. area. I think they're the ones that are highly susceptible to hybridization with these things. And that's actually something I never even thought of about these like 3 species set hybrids where you've got a wild game farm hybrid interbreeding with like a black duck. But it totally makes sense. There's so many of them on the landscape. Why not? And that's something that we've only been able to uncover really with duck DNA, with all these hunters submitting these samples. So honestly, it's been, quite eye-opening for myself, and I think we're going to learn a whole hell of a lot with this program. So hopefully it'll continue.
Wow, we are.
Yeah.
Hey, you and I have had these conversations, Phil. We joked a year or two ago. We started talking about doing all this work, and I said, you know what? And it's fair to worry about hybridization, especially with mallards, right? But I told him, I said, this may sound stupid, but I said, if you watch mottle ducks and you watch black ducks, you watch their behavior, I'm convinced that there are individuals within those species that want to be mottle ducks and want to be black ducks and will not mate with mallards.
Yeah.
And I think Phil believes that. And like he said, the whole annual cycle sort of influences, right? The salt marsh habitats, mallards typically don't venture that far into those. So it's sort of this niche that's occupied by the black ducks. They go there during winter and then go back up into the boreal, like Phil said. And, some of those birds, one of the long running, I guess, hypotheses or thoughts is if you are a hen black duck, why would you not want to mate with a male mallard? Because mallards we view as like being really adaptable. I kind of joke with people. I'm like, if we can grow a millet on the moon, a mallard's going to find it, right? They can live everywhere. But it's interesting in that some of these individuals it just seems like they'll never be hybridized, and whether that's a behavioral thing or just a habitat isolation or a niche separation thing, whatever that is. I hope we have that. And interesting, you guys may or may not know this, and Phil can speak to it, but there's always been 2 populations of mottle ducks, the Gulf Coastal and Florida. And the Florida mottle duck is more closely related to a mallard than it is the Gulf Coastal mottle ducks.
Interesting.
And so, yes, they can fly, right? They're ducks, but based on band recoveries, hunters harvest records, any work that's been done, rarely is there interchange across longitudinally from Gulf Coast to Florida and vice versa. And Phil, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's pretty amazing. The isolation, it's almost, Florida's not an island, but you can almost think of those birds like an island population. They're sedentary and
They do their thing, and that's all they do.
And one of the first times I heard him speak years ago, and Phil, you can tell him about this, but it's like, have we always had were there just brown ducks that came here and settled like the coastline, basically the ice-free areas, or did we have mallards here and they've since morphed? And one of the things I heard him speak at a conference on is really interesting. You can have this green head, but like in 2 generations, Phil, you can basically be a brown mallard. You can just lose that if you don't need that. One of the reasons why we have all these multicolored males in the dabbling ducks is they all go back to the prairies, and a lot of them nest, in proximity to one another. So it's kind of mate separation, and plumages function for, mate attraction, things like that. But when you don't need a bright plumage, like on some of these, like Florida, for example, or black ducks in the Northeast, you can revert from the bright plumage in like 2 generations. Phil, is that correct?
It's more than that, but
it's pretty fast, right?
I mean, it's hard. It's hard to say, because, and the reason I say this is I'll tell a story. Okay, so for Brian's right. So these were the hypotheses, right? So like, why do we have hybrids here, right? Why is it hybridization? Is it something else? And I dove deep into this with black ducks and both mottled ducks and Mexican duck, and what I came out with is that it was never really hybridization. It was that it was all mallards. So you can imagine the country was all mallards, and these glaciers basically came down and broke them apart into these refugia, right? Mm-hmm. Florida, Gulf Coast region we know is a refugia for a lot of species. The Chihuahuan Desert turned into a wetland, right, during those times. Like, it was a beautiful area to hunt ducks. And then you've got this other duck in the East Coast, and as the glaciers retreated, and you had boreal forests in the east, and you got sort of like these other remnant mallard populations. Over the last 500,000 years, they essentially diverged from the mallard. But it's only been about 500,000 years, right? Plus minus. And the thing that we found is that all these, if you shoot a black duck, a mottled duck, a Mexican duck, can't shoot a Hawaiian duck, but if you could, and you shot a bird and you're like, oh man, this is a hybrid. If it is a juvenile, if it's a first year, a hatch year, it's very unlikely it's actually a hybrid. And what we find is that those first year males will show mallard traits, not due to hybridization, just because they like can't control their genetics, right? It's like a prepubescent male that like can't control its testosterone. So it's sort of modelly expressing mallard traits. If it lives into the second year, we have data on all those species that now shows that if it lives into the second year, it essentially turns brown, and it'll stay brown. And if it lives until 6 or 7, it'll all of a sudden start expressing again mallard traits, because it's getting old. It can't like control its testosterone or estrogen. We're not exactly sure how it's mechanism wise. That means all of them have those mallard genetics in them. It's about expressing and suppressing. Now you ask, why would they stay brown? The whole point is that if you keep high levels of testosterone in males, and mallards tells the system to turn brown the next time they molt, because the next time they molt is non-breeding. Low levels of testosterone tells them turn green, right? Because it's like, oh, I'm not breeding. I have low amounts of testosterone. So the next time I need to go through molt, that molt better turn me green because I'm about to go breed, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what happens is that you're constantly at high rates of testosterone. So you're always telling your system, turn brown, turn brown, turn brown. Because what we think is happening amongst these monochromatics, or these brown ducks, is that they have this potential ability, at least for mottled ducks, Mexican ducks, and Hawaiian ducks, to essentially breed anytime that habitat is available. Now, is it year-round? Probably not. But much longer than expected, especially for our study here in Mexican ducks. Their pair bonded come September, October, or even earlier. And so we think that's also a mechanism that a greenhead comes in and that female is like, no, you're supposed to be brown. And potentially that also allows that female to say, ooh, you're a young male, right? So if you're like splotchy and looking hybridy like, maybe that's a mechanism of why we essentially can't find hybrids. I went to Mexico, almost every state in Mexico, and shot 300-400 birds with the help of others. And we couldn't find a hybrid. We found tons of birds that looked like a mallard, but not one of them was an actual hybrid. So that started to showcase to me that these birds have so recently diverged from the mallard that those mechanisms are still being parsed out. And maybe they'll stay there forever. Maybe it is a good thing for the female to be like, oh, you got green in your head, you're a young male, I don't want to breed with you. I don't know.
He thinks like a female male. I like how.
So Bobby might be turning green more and more all the time, right?
Yeah. Just about time.
Low testosterone. So look, for all of us here, thank you for paying
Oh
attention
my
to
gosh!
what's going on.
Can I say, Bobby? Look,
Yeah.
I grew up with the grandest bird really that I experienced as a child was the bobwhite quail. They were everywhere. Everybody quail hunted. My dad was a huge quail hunter. And I lived through, it's kind of like the people that lived through the first depression freak out about money stuff. It's like a panic attack when what we've experienced with turkeys hits, because I can remember, and I know there's more done today and we explain more, but guess what? They're still not around. And I experienced that constant, what's going on? I don't know. What's going on? Oh, it's pesticides. Oh, it's farming practices have changed. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. Oh, it's this. And nobody could put their finger on anything for sure. Never. And so, we get the same anxiety over what's happening with wild turkeys, although, hey, not near that bad. And there's so many people care so much, acting so fast, and I guess it's in a more widespread area. We feel like we're starting to get a handle on it. Thank God for all the great biologists and, researchers at universities out there on that. But, we can't sit here and wait till it's too late for something as precious. And that's the thing. Turkeys are here, and we're dealing with them here. Quail were there, and you deal with them there. With their home ranges, whatever, a mile, maybe not that much. This is something that could wipe out the whole country, and you read about it in the history books if we're not careful. And I'm not trying to be over-sensationalizing this, but, in all this discussion, even about the hybridization and what we've learned there, I could listen to them talk all day long. But we have got to all hear the truth, and then we've got to be really smart in whatever it takes to act appropriately on the truth. We've never been able to get this kind of information before. Right. This is the last 4 or 5 year revelation, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, the whole second half of everything I said is it, we're just gearing up to publish. And I'll just like throw this in there. If any listeners are wanting to donate, please, visit my website. I need personnel. If I had a person, a postdoc or a researcher where I could just be like, here's the story, write it up, we could get this thing moving so much faster. Because no agency will ever do anything unless it's published. Like that's just how it works, right? Otherwise it's hearsay. And hopefully you could, if you ever look at like my history of work, there's nothing that I haven't published. I started on fisheries. I did that, and then we moved into obviously all sorts of birds, and waterfowl being my passion. But I was gonna put also another aspect about turkeys. I've got a couple different projects, including one with Mike Chamberlain that recently is starting to look at some of those genetic issues amongst your wild turkeys out there. Hopefully maybe we'll come out and have a conversation about turkeys one day.
We need to look. We can help with the funding. One of the things that we can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our audience, our company. We
have
help.
been setting up for this and preparing ourselves, including financially, for quite some time. And
that's the thing. Personnel. Like if I can get my tech and a person that knows how to write, if I just tell them the story, be like, okay, I got to go do this other project. You write this up. Let's get this out. You know, that is not just about this project. It helps every project. So I'm definitely hoping that someone here listens to it. I'll put one more plug in here, and given that you're Mossy Oak, maybe you'll be interested. I have a PhD student who essentially created a brand new AI brain. And what we're feeding it are genetically vetted pictures of individuals that we have from my own research, as well as all the duck DNA work that we've got going. Now, what we're trying to do is a person will be able to take a picture of a duck. Currently, it's going to be mottled duck, Mexican duck, mallard, including game farm, but we're hoping to get more and more samples of black ducks to include them. And pretty much once it's set up, we can just include as many species as you want. Anyways, the picture will give you species, sex, age, and genetic probability. Right now, we're hoping to develop this for banding crews. It'll standardize how everybody calls what they're calling. But if hunters have this in their hands and are using it, not only can we effectively monitor populations at national levels every single fall migration, and then during spring migration with all the banding crews, you essentially have telemetry data constantly going with people taking pictures. But if state and federal agencies sign on and it all works out, you know, does a feral game farm mallard that you can showcase it with 100% probability. So we can and I will say we can distinguish a game farm from a true wild with 98% probability already. We're good with up to like 50% game farmy in you, which is pretty good. So can you use the app and say, oh, this is just a feral bird or a severely hybridy thing? Maybe it doesn't count towards your bag, and we're helping towards moving, you know, the needle towards more wild that way. Basically, more or less, try to create a mechanism, a tool is what we're trying to do, not only for banding crews and other state agencies and federal agencies, but also for the hunter, right? So they can use it and start to be informed, being like, all right, this is a game farmy thing. Maybe, again, if you're in a special zone or however the state set it up, you know, maybe that allows you to shoot a few extra non-wild mallards is what I would call them.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty interesting.
Really?
All of it.
Everything is-
Everything is
Yeah,
interesting.
let
Like,
me
whoa,
ask you
man.
this.
And you know, at $4.99 for the
Yeah.
premium package.
Yeah, no problem.
So get some apple glasses to wear while you're duck hunting that tells you if it's a game farm bird or not.
So look, maybe there's a way we can help you.
I would just say we are going to help. So,
Yeah.
so
There you
literally, I think back when we're doing podcasts and everybody else is interacting, and I just have these flashbacks. Why in the world have we been so blessed to be in this position? And you know, I believe in being grateful, and then everybody here should too. And one of the primary things is, I mean, to look after the resource. That's same. Y'all wear it even bigger than us, but we, in a bigger way, we have a huge influence and responsibility. There's nothing more important to us than taking care of the resources out there. Nothing. That is. I mean, we don't even have hunting and fishing if we don't take care of the resource. Much like that's one reason we're actually in the real estate and land business too. You don't have the resource without taking care of the land.
So Phillip,
Nice.
we got a couple of guys who have nodded at me. They got questions, and I want to ask one that just keeps bubbling up in my mind. Knowing what you know, and Brian, you too, knowing what you guys know, and y'all are both duck hunters. Are y'all stressed out about all this? I'm looking at you. I'm looking at
Brian,
you,
you-
Phillip. You look stressed out.
Yeah. I mean,
doesn't
like,
sleep at all.
So when I first started finding this, and I'd sit in my little blind and in my New Mexico spot, and mallard comes in, and I shoot it, and I'm like, God, I hope this isn't a game farm mallard. You know, like in my mind at this point, what's occurring is a privatized good polluting a public good, right? The ability, the innateness, the wildness of a bird being succumbing to like
don't even
our
say it. It's
our
sickening.
own faults is in my view, is a problem.
It's
and
sickening.
and you know what? I don't blame anybody for anything. People do things with the best intentions, with the knowledge that they had at the time. That doesn't mean that we can't do something now.
That's right. And
It's how
blame,
I see it.
honestly, look, blame doesn't even do you any good. It's pretty,
Yeah.
it's pretty useless in anything in life, friendship, marriage, everything. But
Exactly. Let's ask
Haven't-
let's
haven't-
ask the next question. How do we move forward?
that's
is
right.
really
Knowing the truth and making good decisions do count. That has nothing
Yes.
to do with blame.
Mac, you got a question?
All right, so I've got 19 written down, so we're just going to go with 2 of them. I've been raising my hand, but I don't think Bobby's seen me. So back to the, I guess, the evolution of their nose and their legs, is that evolution or is that a cause of inbreeding? Like, can you make a differential?
No. Yeah. So evolution is what Mother Nature does. What the game farm mallard is, or a cow, or a chicken, or any of that kind of stuff, that's our work, right? That's true man's hand, because we took something and then we shaped it into the thing that we wanted. So the bill and the legs, that's not evolution. That's unknown artificial selection, or known artificial selection, right? It's sort of like, you take a wolf and people have asked me, like, well, how could we possibly do that to a bird? And I'd be like, how'd you turn a wolf into a chihuahua? Artificial selection is strong. Like, we can do basic, if you're killing everybody except for these 2 small things, and you keep only breeding 2 dogs that are smaller and smaller and smaller, you're going to get smaller dogs. And that's basically what we did with everything else, right?
Yeah, we see it with
it's the same
plants,
thing.
too.
If you want egg production or meat production, ducks have been chosen for different things, fanciness. You go to a park and you see those ducks with those tufts on their head and everything. Yeah, it was once a mallard, but now it's just this like fancy, weird looking cayuga or whatever they are.
Scovey.
So my other question, you don't seem like a big stats guy. That's a joke, obviously. But so what was the ratio for wild and farm raised in the 20s? Like, do you have like you said, it was
Yeah.
So what was that, and then how long would
I
it
wish
take to reverse that
Yeah,
out?
I wish I could show you the figure. Yeah, so what you see is this blip in the 20s, and in 3 of the flyways. It was the Pacific, Mississippi, and Atlantic, and it was about 20%, right? And then in the 30s, all 4 flyways were back to 0. So and then it was only the Mississippi and the Atlantic that started to just creep up, 40s, 50s, 60s. Just the Atlantic flyway, just like, huge linear increase in those years. So what I was thinking, what was occurring is that they did it, and then it took like a decade to get production and whatever going. And during that time, like, natural selection essentially like swept all the stuff that they initially put out the door, but then eventually they kept putting it. And if I could show you that, the Mississippi in the 70s went back into 100% wild basically, but the Atlantic flyway never came down. The best it came down to is about 30% in the 70s, but it never reached 0% game farm anymore, and it's been just oscillating up and down ever since the 70s.
Because would you speculate or whatever? Because it's had a more constant supply of the tame.
Constant supply, smaller population.
Yeah.
So it's faster to inundate. So the Mississippi did the same trend, but way lower, right? The proportions were way lower. And that's because it was a much larger population and they probably had a constant influence of prairie pothole birds. So you kind of had this sort of ebb and flow that was occurring at the time. But yeah, the Atlantic flyway just had less mallards and more birds being put on over 90% of all game farm releases the Atlantic flyway, northeastern part especially.
Wow.
And so, yeah, once you inundate a population and that the parental pool becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and when you can't go back to 0 is when all you have is hybrids with hybrids, and at that point, unless there's an influx naturally into it, which is unlikely, there's nowhere else to go. And this is what's happened in Hawaii. I didn't really go into it, but a similar situation has occurred in Hawaii on many of the islands. And so we're using one of those islands as our testing pool, which we also need some additional funding for. But we're going to actually test because it's a much smaller population. We can control all the aspects about it and to try to see if our theoretical models will actually work in nature. Because our models are models, right? Mother Nature is its own beast. So we'll see.
You got one.
Hopefully it
more,
works.
All right, they tell me I have one more for you. Okay, so if you were to put a percentage on how this affects the total decline of, say, the North American waterfowl species, what percent would you put that with the hybridization of the farm-raised birds?
Well, I think it's not 0. It's not 1. It's somewhere in the middle, right? So the problem why I can't answer it. So now knowing what I know from like Ben's work and others and showing that, yeah, migration, survival, fecundity, all of these matrices that are so important in viability of a populations are all lower because of their genetics, right? We're actually hoping to find the exact markers that are associated, right? We're basically doing cancer research at this point where we're finding the genes associated to those traits. And with this data, I think I'll be able to answer your question in about a year, is what I'm trying to say. I think that it's additive to everything else, right? Urbanization is not it. The funny fact is, the more urban you get, are you actually increasing the survival of those kinds of birds? That's a good question, right?
Seems like it.
But you're decreasing all the wild birds. So it's like this, are you pushing the landscape towards what you actually don't want on the landscape? That's a good question. But the other part of it, if you've got a bunch of birds in an urban setting that with about only 1 out of 4 of them completing nesting, you should always see a population decline. And so I can't give you a number, but it's more than 0.
All right. We'll find out next year.
So
Yep, have him back.
I'm kind of looking around the room. Did anybody else hear and kind of recognize that Phillip sent his wife on a mission to some of these game farms
Yeah,
to
I did notice
secure some of these
Samples.
ducks?
That's because he
Or
can't hit the
bring them back.
broadside of a barn.
How did that go?
It went great. She was texting me the whole time. She'd be like, "Oh, yeah, you got 20." I was like, "All right, well, just like get to 30," and the nice thing was I was getting like, okay, so they had to release 100 birds to shoot 30, not because they missed, because 70 of them went to the WMA that was right by the place.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
my
no, that
gosh.
was the.
Ugh.
Well, she's like, "Oh, they're going to the left. They're going to the right," and I was like, just looking broadly, like, what the hell's over there? And I was like, "Oh man, they're just like, at least a good proportion of them probably went to some hunter bag." Here's the fun fact: we don't know any of the regulations really of it. Every state is completely different. Now, this particular state, the way it works is between the hours of 10 and 2. You are no longer within the confines of game bags. So before 10 or after 2, it would be a wild shoot. You can only shoot however many mallards that U.S. Fish and Wildlife says for that year. But between 10 and 2, you can shoot as many mallards as you want. And I was always blown away by that, because I was like, I'm pretty sure I've shot lots of greenheads between those hours too. But,
I just don't understand.
anyways,
Oh,
between
man.
10 and 2, we got 30 birds out of there.
This is a federal migratory bird.
That's right.
How can you call a game farm mallard? I mean, they're calling it a mallard, but they're letting
Correct. They're not.
But they're letting people farm them like a a backyard chicken so people can come shoot them.
You know,
Correct. So
I'm not even here
So
to
let me-
judge all that, but you got to know the consequences. And if the consequences are a detriment to our precious wild resource, I'm sorry.
You gotta quit.
The truth is the truth.
Well, so yes, and I'm 100% agreed. Like I said, I think that this is like what blew my mind and why I never thought this was possible is because we're not dealing with an endangered species of like 100 individuals or 1,000 individuals. We've got millions of individuals. So how do you like screw that up, right? And apparently, and then I should always remind myself, like,
Look at history.
we could basically screw anything up.
Yes,
So
exactly.
we could do anything our minds
Yes.
if you put our minds to it. And so, yeah, it is. I will tell you right now that in parts of this country, it's a very political landscape when it comes to these things. It blows
Sure,
my mind.
yeah.
Like somebody probably
Well,
is just like,
it's-
how are you guys debating this about a little duck? But
It's-
it is. And getting back to your point, they are not considered under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. That's how this works. That's why you can sell, move, and do whatever you want with these game farm mallards, is because they're not actually protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Now, a year ago, there was this weird little caveat that came about and said anything that has 1% wild in them is protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Well, if that's the case, now you can't breed, sell, or do anything with them unless you
That's
have the
right.
permits. 1 year later, this year, that caveat is no longer there. So in my conspiracy theory, somebody tried to have their cake and eat it and be like, oh, no, like it's protected, we can do, but then they're like, oh, wait, now we can't do whatever we want with them. So this is this weird dynamic that's occurring.
So,
Yeah.
So-
So technically, currently, they're not protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. That's why if we had this app and somebody shot a feral bird, I think there's a good case to be made where it's like, well, it's just a barn duck.
Yeah. The
Yeah,
people
but,
that we
look-
vote for allow this to happen.
there's no logic in here. So let's just say, even if it's like, and it's not true, but even if it was true, okay, these raised release birds, they don't travel, they don't intermingle, they don't travel. Guess what? All the wild birds do, and even if they stay in a little small area, wild birds are going to be through there and intermingle with them. It doesn't matter. Obviously they do travel, but even if they didn't, it still doesn't matter.
That's right. And I think that recent pup from the folks out of the Smithsonian, that was a bit eye-opening to me because I was like, those were, I think they were like 15-week-old, birds, fully grown adults, so to speak, and they basically found every disease in them already. So even if they didn't travel, you are absolutely right. You know what's the best decoy out there? A live decoy.
Mm-hmm.
And so these birds on the landscape, just being on the landscape, in my opinion, is also not only now not a problem for not only a problem for mallards, but now again, just if this is the case and they are this sort of reservoir of disease, they are now a problem for many species, even beyond ducks.
Yeah, there's no doubt.
So we've got the headwind of this, call it what you want, disagree if you want, but the warmer winters, you can call it if it's global warmer or not. I don't want to get into that debate. But we've had warmer and warmer winters. We did finally one time for a couple of days, we broke some ice last year. We went 3 straight years of not even breaking ice during duck season here. And then on top of that, this dilemma, seems to be compounding that effect. So I just want to throw this out because there's kind of this whole discussion about, everybody that are caregivers for the species, especially you guys, but all the wildlife officials and, the volunteers, the DU people, all of that. But then there's average hunter guys who are guys. And so I want y'all to tell me that. I want to say this and kind of in front of everybody. I want you to say, yeah or no, that makes no difference. I'm encouraging everybody to take a little matters in their own hands. If they are managing for waterfowl, it's like for your own hunting, and this time is so hard to get them far to the south, establish your own like rest pond refuge place if you don't have one already. It is going to be in my opinion, the single number one thing to you being able to enjoy this sport more.
Absolutely.
Further south. And it's going to be better for the ducks too, but you got to be able to establish that, and don't expect miracles in a year either. But if you
Absolutely.
do, I think it's one of the things you can take it in your own hands a little bit, because if they can come south and they find lots of food and they're happy with it and you don't harass them to death, you're going to get a lot of opportunities to shoot them in the area around that anyway. You're going to have so much better chance that they'll continue to migrate regardless of conditions, I think.
Absolutely. That conversation, ice eaters and corn and all that stuff, comes up all the time when I have conversations with folks. And the one thing that I have to constantly remind everybody is, even if that was the case, it's compounded by the fact that these birds don't even cue. It appears that they can't even cue to migrate. So even if you got rid of all that, if you don't get rid of the apparent underlying problem, which is more or less they're driven by their genetics, to be able to be like, hey, it's time to migrate, you'll never get those ducks back. And so I think that's an important aspect to keep in mind, especially for you. Now, you guys get a whole bunch of birds out of the prairie potholes, which is great. But that whole secondary push that Mississippi Alluvial Valley used to have, were likely those Great Lakes birds that have been trending towards the wrong way.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what we've been seeing.
I could listen to it all the time, and none of us can learn too much. I mean, we got to be careful not to go too far too fast or make, I leave that to who we're talking to, our guests here.
Yeah.
Who are researching and vetting these things and learning. But we all, as a community, you can't learn too much. You just can't.
So look, we're all getting really frustrated listening to all this. Phillip, we love ducks so much. Brian, we love what you guys are doing. Let's kind of lighten things up a little bit. We like to ask our guests, so we'll do both of you guys. We're going to ask y'all a trivia question about duck hunting, and if y'all get it right, you win one of the coveted podcast T-shirts.
Whoa.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Yeah. So we have a segment, and it's brought to you by our friends at Sheffield.
You can't put it on eBay for a bunch of money either. You have to keep it.
And the two of y'all can talk about this.
That's worth a
yourselves.
genetic sample to him, though.
Yeah, that's right.
So, Jason, would you play the Sheffield music there, please?
Today's trivia is brought to you by Sheffield Financial. Explore swift, effortless, and convenient financing for power sports, outdoor power equipment, and trailers, fueling your pursuits in hunting, fishing, and game keeping. More details at sheffieldfinancial.com.
All right, Phillip, you're going to have to bear with us just a little bit. This is Jason's first time on Mac, who normally asks the trivia questions, had to go to a pickleball tournament or something.
Yeah.
So some lucky winner has just won, and I'll go ahead and
Wasn't it a listener?
we picked somebody who left a review.
Yeah,
lane,
that's right. There you go.
just won the Ryan Kirby framed print Bottomland Bachelors.
Golly.
That thing is valued at $450.
Oh.
And so who won that, Jason?
CL Cameron 90.
CL Cameron 90. You're a winner of the Bottomland Bachelors. $450 print.
If they don't claim it, can I take it?
Yeah.
Well, you couldn't get it for that
Maybe
either.
so.
I mean,
it's awesome. So look at Phillip smiling over there. He's excited about this T-shirt. So
I think he's thinking
Phil.
there's a spot on his wall for that print back there, Bobby.
Right there.
There you go.
yeah. Okay. So what do we need to do, right? Cleveland, go ahead.
Here's the question.
Based on the 2021-22 season, can you name 3 of the top 5 states for total duck kills?
Wait, can I discuss? Is this just me?
No,
No, you and Brian can
y'all
discuss
are
this.
well-
So we're
yeah.
going to sit here and watch y'all at this point.
You can phone a friend, but it's Brian.
Three of the top 5
Brian,
states.
I think it's
for total
it's
harvest.
would it be California, Arkansas, and it's either Texas or New York?
Louisiana.
What?
Louisiana.
Oh, Louisiana.
I
Louisiana.
agree with y'all. I don't know.
So give us your official answers now.
Brian, you answer.
Arkansas,
I want
Louisiana.
this T-shirt, and I can blame you if we don't get
Arkansas,
it.
Louisiana, and I would say
California.
California. Yep.
Wow.
Did they get it, Jason?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
they got it.
Yes.
There they go.
Boom.
Let me tell you, I didn't realize California was the #1 state.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Now, what? Nate, read them out,
California is
Jason.
huge.
It's California 929,000, Arkansas
Yeah.
915,000, Texas 694,000, Louisiana 614,000, and Minnesota 428,000.
Minnesota.
Yeah.
I was like, is it New York or is it? I knew Minnesota shot a lot of ducks.
I didn't know
Yeah.
California was killing that many ducks.
I didn't know there were that many hunters in California.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot. You
Well,
go
guess-
outside the urban
well,
areas,
but
there's
guess-
a lot of hunters.
Think about it though. They are raising ducks like crazy,
Yeah.
and they have a 110-day season and a more of a limit too.
And more
So they
ducks.
can.
We're
they
doing
can-
something wrong.
They can enjoy more, and evidently they're doing something right because they have more liberal seasons and more liberal bag limits, and they still keep outraising. The
I
rest
just
of the
assumed
country.
they were surfing and bird watching instead of hunting. But
No,
anyway.
rural
Yeah, you
I
know,
digress.
I was hoping for that too, but when I used to sit in like 2 a.m. sweat line, it'd be like 400 people around me. I'm like, why are all
What are
all
y'all
of
doing?
you here?
Yeah.
California on the state areas, it is like a tailgate here. They get there on the
man.
Monday before opening day on Saturday.
Wow.
And the
Oh,
RVs
man,
are all
it's-
backed in all the way around the lots, and then some in the middle, and it's like Mississippi State Ole Miss football.
Wow.
How about that?
Yeah.
Well, good for California to be that big of duck hunters out there.
Yeah.
Good for
Yeah.
no doubt.
yeah,
Public
for
access
sure.
huge too out there.
There's
good on you.
There's a lot of things going on there. That could be a whole nother show, but the drought, the willy-nilliness of the weather out there now is really impacting things. The other thing,
Yeah.
the other reason that California has had so many breeding mallards in the past is they have a set-aside program.
Right.
So on all those rice farms, a lot of those ag areas used to have, I don't know the status of it now, it may be gone, but I know when I was out there, you would have these beautiful prairie-looking fields that were set aside. They had to set aside 15 or 25% fill, something like that, and they were
Yeah,
just
that's
hot
right.
spots for breeding ducks.
bet
Is
so.
a- is a-
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
good.
need to talk about some of that around here.
I was gonna say I just came back from California. I was driving through my old stomping ground, just looking at it. I've never seen so much water and so much rice being grown right now. They must have had 100% allocation right now. So
Oh, wow,
it should
okay.
be a hell. As long as the ducks come down, it should be a hell of a hunt down there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Phillip Lavretsky, University of Texas,
you go.
El Paso, doing some incredible research.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
I mean, this is really surprising.
Phil is our friend.
You blew our minds.
No doubt
today.
about it.
And I'm looking over at Brian, Dr. Brian Davis. We appreciate you coming over here. But together, y'all are working on
Yeah,
doing
it's
some
good
important
to
stuff.
see. I'd watched that camaraderie, and while he was rolling, how he just kind of sat quietly to give him his space to say what he needed to say for everybody to learn. It's pretty cool to watch them work together. You can tell there's a deeper camaraderie what y'all do because you're working for a higher cause than just killing something, you know.
He's our
yeah.
Ducks Tom Brady quarterback.
That's
Genetics.
cool.
Genetics.
Well, I'll
was
tell you
awesome.
one thing. I want to go hunting with Dr. Phil.
We're going to
Let's
go
go
out
hunt
there.
with Dr.
We're
Phil.
coming to hunt with you in El Paso.
I'll tell you what, you're hooked up with the Dr. Phil for turkeys with Mike too.
Oh man. Well, yeah, you just got to be faster than me on the trigger. So
That's what I'm trying. Hey, well, sign us up, buddy.
Lanny he's good with these. He's got these long elbows, and they'll pin you to the back of the tree if you're not careful.
When you tell Bobby to shoot, you better have your fingers in your ears
true.
already, though.
Well,
No.
it's been our pleasure to get to meet you today.
Thanks so much for enlightening us.
That was incredible
My
to
goodness,
listen
incredible.
to, and we want to honestly, we need to stay in close touch. Not to be biased,
Yeah.
but we're Mississippi State University is
Yeah.
kind of an extension of all of us here, and all the people over there. It's incredible, and keep us apprised if there needs to be more communication to people out there. That could help in any way towards this coming season. We will
That's
let
what
us
we do.
know, and we'll be glad to get the word out.
Spread it out.
We're a microphone.
yeah, no,
for you.
Love it.
I was just gonna say thank you so much for having me on. I mean, in my opinion, what I've learned is that these are the conversations that to keep happening,
Yes.
so that way hopefully the right ears eventually hear it, so we can start moving forward in a positive path. And I think we're going there. The more people that listen to it, hear the stories, start to see there's been so many people that come to me like, man, what you said, I saw.
Yes.
I
No
saw
doubt.
this happening, and it's like time and time again, and that tells me what we're finding is truth on the landscape. And so, obviously, always more to do, but I think we're doing it at lightning speed. And I will just plug in Duck DNA again. Please sign up www.duckdna.com. And then, of course, if you're willing and able to fund and want to do a tax deductible contribution, please find me, Lavretsky Lab at University of Texas El Paso online. Contribute so that way we can, my team can keep going and get this thing done, head in the right direction as fast as we can.
No, that's awesome. And all that will be in the show notes, guys.
Yeah,
so
we'll get that in there.
Check that out. We're on your team, and we're glad to be there.
That's right.
Wow.
Heck yeah. Now I'm just waiting for my shirt, so I can really rock it.
Well, it did. Just hang on. It's on the way. All right, guys. I'm looking around. Brian, thank you for being here. Thanks,
man.
everybody.
Thank
Everybody
you
stayed
for
with
what
us
y'all do.
today.
Yeah,
Incredible
stuff.
work. Thank you.
Super
Why
important.
don't you say goodbye, Dudley?
Goodbye, Dudley.
Get us out of here, Cleve.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Gamekeeper Podcast. And be sure to tune in again. Subscribe to Gamekeeper Farming for Wildlife magazine, and don't miss the Mossy Oak Properties Fistful of Dirt podcast with my good buddy, Ronnie Cuz Strickland.